All right, well today we're going to continue our discussion of the Reformation, and we'll be moving to the Reformation in Scotland. All right, the Reformation in Scotland. There was a need for Reformation in Scotland because in the 1500s, the Catholic Church owned one half the real estate of the nation. And the income that the church received was 18 times the receipts of the crown. So you can see that the church was dominant both politically and materially, and in a sense, there was oppression there, and those in the church were taking financial advantage of those to whom they were supposed to be serving spiritually. I thought that before we moved too far into the lecture about the Reformation, we might talk a little bit about Scotland and St. Andrew's. Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, one of Jesus' apostles, has a lot of legends built up around his life. We really do not have accurate historical information about him, but we do have a lot of legends built up around him. And one of those legends is that that Andrew ministered in Greece and there was crucified on an X-shaped cross. The story that we have is similar to the story that we have on Simon Peter, but that is that when they came to execute Andrew, they told him that he was going to be crucified, and he made the statement, "I'm not worthy to die as my Lord," and so they crucified him on an X-shaped cross. And then and this was in Greece, so his relics were housed in Constantinople until about 800, and that's when the relics were brought to Scotland, to a king named Ingus, spelled O-E-N-G-U-S, and King Ingus supposedly went into a battle, and as he prayed to St. Andrew, he saw in the sky clouds that shaped the form of an X. And so he took this as a sign that he would be victorious, and indeed he was, and that's why Andrew became the patron saint of Scotland. And so we have St. Andrew's University, St. Andrew's Castle. There's much is made of St. Andrew in Scotland, and this is a representation of their flag, which is the white cross against a sky blue field. Okay, so that's just something a little bit interesting from ancient church legend. Well, the political situation in Scotland was that under the reign of the Stuarts, the political and religious policy was to maintain independence from England by creating alliances with France, particularly marital alliances. And this intermarrying then played a big role in the history of both Scotland and England. And here's a family tree that I copied off the internet, and it's going to show some interesting connections between England and Scotland. To begin with, we talked last week about the House of Tudor and Henry VII, and he of course is the father of Henry VIII. But Henry VIII had a sister Margaret. And Margaret married James IV of Scotland. So whereas I just said that normally Scotland allied itself with France, here's an exception. Scotland allied itself with England by marrying James IV to Margaret Tudor. Now, James IV, but with James IV, Margaret had a son, James V, who became King of Scotland later. But James IV died, and Margaret Tudor, this isn't on your on this chart, but Margaret Tudor then married Archibald Douglas. And with her second husband, she had a daughter, Margaret Douglas, who then married Matthew Stewart, and they had a son, Henry Stewart, Lord Darnley. So keep that in mind, that Margaret Tudor had a son, James V, who became king, and then one of her descendants by her second husband was Henry Stewart, Lord Darnley. All right, let's go on and pick up again with James V, and he could have married Mary Tudor, the daughter of Henry VIII, to create a stronger alliance with England, but instead he married Mary of Guise from France, and then they had a daughter. They had a daughter, Mary, who became known as Mary, Queen of Scots, and Mary could have married Edward VI. Of course, even though Edward VI became king at age 9 and died at age 15, nonetheless, there was an opportunity for a betrothal there. Again, an alliance with England, but that was refused, and Mary, Queen of Scots, was married to Francis II, King of France. And so for a while, she was the Queen of France. But then when Francis died, then she married Henry Lord Darnley. And they had a son that became James VI, King of Scotland, and then he was king of another country. Do you remember? He became King James I of England when Elizabeth died without an heir. And the reason that they chose James to be the King of England is that James had connections to the Tudor line, not only through his mother, Mary, tracing her line up through James IV and Margaret Tudor, but James also had a connection through his father, Henry Lord Darnley, back through Margaret Tudor. So James was connected from two directions to the Tudor line, and so that's why he became king of not only Scotland but also England. All right, that's kind of complicated, but I went through all of that, and of course this is now in your notes. At least the main line is it doesn't give Margaret Tudor's secondary line, but anyway, it's there, and you can see why it's important, why Mary Queen of Scots is important, and why James is important, because we've already talked about James in talking about the Reformation in England, but we'll talk quite a bit about Mary Queen of Scots in the Reformation in Scotland. All right, so in Scotland, there was a Protestant movement before 1546 because of the Lollard and Hussite views. You remember who the Lollards were? They were followers of a major figure in the English Reformation? Wycliffe, John Wycliffe. Yes, thank you very much. John Wycliffe, the morning star of the Reformation, one of the early reformers who was active in England in translating the Bible. Wycliffe's followers were the Lollards. Lollard being a word meant mumbler. They called them mumblers because they kind of had to talk in secret because they were being prosecuted by the Catholic Church. But the Lollards were connected to John Huss and the Hussites because those from Bohemia had come to England to study at Oxford, and so they became influenced by Wycliffe as well. So these early Protestant views had an impact in Scotland, circulating more freely among the nobility. The nobility were opposed to the monarchs, and the monarchs were predominantly Catholic, and so that inclined the nobility toward the Protestant religion for political reasons as well as religious reasons. I think as we go through church history, we're going to find that politics plays an important role. All right, let's talk about Patrick Hamilton, who is one of the early reformers in Scotland. Many of the university students in Scotland became attracted to the Reformation through the writings of Martin Luther, and Hamilton in particular became interested in Martin Luther, and so he went to Wittenberg and Marburg and visited Martin Luther and Ulrich Zwingli, and returned to spread Lutheran views in Scotland. He wrote a book and was condemned as a heretic. Then he fled to Germany, but he returned to Scotland because he felt there was a great need there for the gospel. When he returned to Scotland, he was challenged to a debate by the Archbishop of St. Andrew's Cathedral. But when Hamilton arrived for the debate, instead of a debate, he found a trial. And so he was arrested and tried for heresy. Heresy trials normally would take weeks, but instead this conviction was pushed through in 12 hours. And so he was burned at the stake. His martyrdom contributed to the advancement of Protestantism among the nobility. As we have often said, those dissenters who are martyred attract attention to their cause because of their devotion. And so those who were already inclined toward the Protestant faith became more zealous because of Hamilton's example. Those who were less familiar with Protestant faith began to inquire and to learn more about it because of the visibility of Hamilton's execution. This is a quote that comes from one of his biographers. "The smoke of Mr. Patrick Hamilton has infected as many as it did blow upon." Okay, so a beautiful image here of the smoke from the fire spreading the views of the Protestant faith in Scotland. The next major reformer was George Wishard, and again he was banished from Scotland for promoting Protestantism, but he returned to preach the gospel. Look at what he did. He entered churches and would preach fiery sermons in the Scottish language instead of in Latin, so he gained a lot of attention in that way. Does this remind you of an Anabaptist reformer? George Blaurock. Yes, George Blaurock was one we mentioned that he would walk into a church and say to the priest, "Why are you here?" "Well, I'm here to preach." "No, God called me to preach." Well, George Wishard did the same thing. The difference is that George Wishard came in with his bodyguard who were carrying big two-handed swords, and so the priest very willingly stepped back and let him preach. Also, Wishart did something very unusual. He led them in singing of hymns. which was not common in those days. And so he would preach in their language and would sing hymns. Now, again, the Catholic Church very much opposed to these Protestant reformers, and the Cardinal David Beaton, had Wishard arrested and burned at the stake. Then, in retaliation, the Protestants assassinated Beaton and then occupied St. Andrew's Castle. What happened is that Cardinal Beaton, though he was a man of cloth, he kept a mistress, and they watched her, and as she left one night, they entered in through the door that she exited, and that's how they got into the castle. They hung the cardinal, and then they abused his body. It was said that one of his executioners actually urinated into the mouth of the body of Cardinal Beaton. So obviously a very crude way of retaliating against this man who had executed their friend and leader, George Wishard. So the Scottish Reformation essentially began in 1546, but did not make much progress for the next 15 years. John Knox is the man who's credited with forwarding the advance of Protestantism in Scotland, and he was one of he's one of Wishard's bodyguards. He was one who carried a two-handed sword and followed Wishard around. So when Wishard barged into a church, John Knox was there to be sure that no one barred him from preaching. He was educated at St. Andrew's University and was converted to Protestantism somewhere around 1542. We really do not have the story of his conversion from Catholicism to the Protestant faith. We do know that on his deathbed, he asked his wife Marie to read to him from John chapter 18, and he said this is where I first cast my anchor. So possibly John 18 had an influence on him. I looked at John 18, and there is it puzzles me as to why this particular passage would have had such an impact on him. Certainly it describes Jesus' passion and suffering, because it talks about the betrayal of Judas against Jesus. It talks about Jesus before the priests, Peter's denial of Jesus, Jesus before Pilate, and then Jesus' confession, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. And then he said to Pilate, said further, you say correctly that I am a king, for this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. And so it may be what was so meaningful to John Knox was the fact that the gospel is the truth. And as John Knox learned of the Protestant faith, he felt like he was learning the truth. And as he preached, he was teaching the truth. Nonetheless, John 18 was a significant passage. Whether it led to his conversion, we do not know. But after Wishard's death, he led the movement through bold and open preaching. 1547, he was with the other Protestants in St. Andrew's Castle, but the French came up against them because, again, Scotland was allied with France, and France being a very Catholic nation, and the Scottish monarchy being allied to France not only through marriages, but also through their common religion, they called upon France to attack these rebels who were at St. Andrew's Castle. So they laid siege against the castle. They defeated the Protestants, and he, along with others, were captured by the French, and he was made a galley slave for 19 months. So during this period of more than a year and a half, he slaved in the galleys for the French. He said later that his kidney ailments and stomach ulcers plagued him for the rest of his life because of his slavery and labor during this time. Well, it was under the reign of Edward VI and through his influence that Knox was released from the galleys. And so Knox then went to England, and there he worked for the English Reformation. He was a royal chaplain, and he contributed to the 1552 Book of Common Prayer. Someone asked last week who composed the Book of Common Prayer, or who were the king's advisors during this time. Well, John Knox was one of them. So he's an important person in the English Reformation. But after Edward VI, then comes Mary Tudor. Bloody Mary became the queen, and as we said last week, she returned England to Catholicism and began a persecution of all of the Protestants. And so Knox fled from England and went to Geneva. And there he became well acquainted with the great reformer of Geneva, John Calvin. In fact, he pastored an English congregation of refugees from England to Geneva. And, of course, there he came under the influence of Reformed theology as taught by John Calvin. Now, it was during this period of time that he wrote a couple of treatises. One is Admonition to England, which was specifically against Bloody Mary. But then he wrote a treatise that was very poorly titled. It was the first blast of the trumpet against the monstrous regiment of women. All right? Now, again, he addressed this, or the person to whom he was aiming his rant was Bloody Mary, Mary of Tudor, but who followed Mary, Elizabeth, a Protestant who normally would have been an ally of John Knox and would have welcomed his Protestant faith and even his alliance with the Reformation in England. But in this treatise, he asserted that rule by women was against God's plan. And as a result, Elizabeth took it personally and so felt animosity and hostility toward John Knox. So he lost the possibility of allying the Scottish reformers with the English reformers. In 1559, he left Geneva and returned to Scotland to lead the Reformation. All right. Well, back in Scotland, we have further intrigue, and John Knox is going to run crosswise with another female monarch, and this one also named Mary, but this is Mary known as Queen of Scots. And when her father died in 1542, she became by title, the Queen of Scotland, but of course she was an infant at the time. And then later was married to Francis II, King of France, thereby creating this alliance, or continuing the alliance between Scotland and France. But then Frances died, and so she returned to Scotland to claim her throne in 1561. So John Knox arrived in 1559. 2 years later, Mary arrives to become the Queen of Scotland. Well, she now was free to marry, and she married Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, with whom she had a son, James. But in 1567, Stuart was murdered. And the suspected murderer was Earl of Bothwell. And Mary married him, creating quite a scandal in Scotland. And so many of the nobility were opposed to Mary because not only her strong Catholic connections, whereas the nobility were Protestant, but also because of the scandal of her marriage to a man who was suspected of murdering her second husband. So she was pro-France, she was pro-Roman Catholic, and that led to conflict with the Scottish lords. In 1567, the same year that she married Earl of Bothwell, she abdicated. And so her son, James VI, became the king, but of course he was too young to be king, so Protestant leaders became the regents for the throne. And Mary then fled to England to seek protection from Elizabeth, who of course she was related to. But also Mary had a possible claim to the throne of England. So if something were to happen to Elizabeth, Mary herself might have become the Queen of England. And so Elizabeth imprisoned her in order to keep her out of trouble, but nonetheless, Mary was implicated in 3 attempts to assassinate Elizabeth, and so finally Elizabeth ordered Mary's execution. All right, so that's the political intrigue in Scotland. Well, by 1560, the Protestants controlled the Scottish Parliament, and the Parliament commissioned Knox to organize the Reformed Church of Scotland. So we have the Scottish Confession, which is a Reformed confession of faith, the Book of Discipline, which called for Presbyterian polity, that is representative church government. Superintendents worked with clergy and ruling elders at the local and regional levels. That's what representative polity or church government is about. That the local congregation elects elders, and they form they join with other elders to form a synod, and then those leaders participate in the General Assembly, which makes decisions which then are passed back down to the churches. The Book of Discipline, by the way, also proposed public education, hundreds of years before any other public education was proposed elsewhere. So in that sense, it was ahead of its time. The Book of Common Order defined worship and liturgy. They used the Psalter from Geneva. So John Calvin had created and his followers had created a hymn book called the Psalter. Why does it have that name? Psalms. All right. According to Reformed theology, at least of the 1500s, they would not allow hymns to be sung because they were composed by humans. But the Psalms were inspired by God, and so they would take the Psalms, set them to music, and would sing those in the churches. And so the Psalter then are taking the words of the Psalms, setting them to music, and using them in the church. So that was the format for singing in the Scottish churches. And then the Geneva Bible, which was translated in 1560, became the preferred translation of the Bible in Scotland. So this was all part of the Church of Scotland. Well, John Knox is and before we move too far, I want to talk about liturgy. That the Scottish Presbyterians just like the English Puritans did not celebrate Christmas. Christmas was actually outlawed because it was a popish holiday. It was considered a Roman Catholic holiday. And the ceremonies and the traditions seemed pagan. And of course, if you really know the history of some of the traditions that we use at Christmas time, well, yes, they do have pagan backgrounds. And so the Puritans and the Presbyterians did not celebrate Christmas. For them, the only day upon which to celebrate was the Lord's Day every week. So anyway, they didn't celebrate Christmas or Saints' days. Well, John Knox just comes to us known as the Thundering Scot. He was not a man of tact, and he was not a man to hold back. I think he lived his life kind of as the man with the two-handed sword. He didn't always wield the sword itself, but he kind of used his theology and his personality and his driving devotion to his faith in God and his Reformed theology that made a difference in Scotland. All right, he was followed by Andrew Melville, who was influenced by Beza in Geneva, and after Knox's death, Andrew Melville led the Reformation. Now, James the Sixth resisted the Scottish Kirk because, and we know from our study of James in England that even though the Puritans had hoped that because of his upbringing in Presbyterian Scotland that he would bring more reform to England, but that wasn't the case because he had been very hostile to the Presbyterian Church in Scotland. And so as King of England in 1606, he actually imprisoned Melville in the Tower of London. In 1610, Melville was released and then went on to France. In 1640, as we know, talking about the Civil War under the reign of Charles I, it was the Scottish Rebellion that led to the possibility that the House of Commons, the lower house of Parliament, could rise up, unite with the Scots, and ally with the Puritans and bring about a rebellion against Charles I that led to victory against the Royalists and led to the execution of Charles I. But then after the interregnum, after the rule of Oliver Cromwell, the failed rule of Oliver's son Richard, Charles II was restored to the monarchy. The Church of England was restored, and so we have rule by the bishops in 1660, and so then that returned the Church of England to Scotland briefly, 1660 until 1689. Then when William III and Mary came to be King and Queen of England, that reestablished Presbyterianism in Scotland permanently. And to this day, the Presbyterian Church is the official state church of Scotland. Okay, kind of a quick run-through about the Reformation in Scotland. It's important because John Knox, the Thundering Scot, was an important figure, but certainly because of his Reformed theology, we see that very Calvinistic bent in the Presbyterian Church. From this period of time into most of the history of the Presbyterian Church. Now, the Presbyterian Church USA here in America has gone the way of liberal mainline denominations. In fact, I'll say this again, but I might as well say it now, that until 100 years ago, the Presbyterian Church in America was the fortress of conservative Christianity in America. But the seminaries, the theologians, the pastors began down the slippery slope of modernism until today. The Presbyterian Church USA accepts homosexuals in church leadership. They ordain homosexuals. They perform homosexual unions, and they even debate whether Jesus is the only way to salvation. So they deny that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Interestingly enough, the pastor of First Presbyterian Church in New Orleans pastors with his companion. I mean, he is in a homosexual union as he pastors First Presbyterian Church in New Orleans. So that just shows you where the Presbyterian Church has come to today compared to its beginnings. Right. And so I say this many times in relationship to the conservative resurgence in the Southern Baptist Convention, because although that was an event that happened really before some of you were born, certainly before you came into your interest in ministry, but nonetheless, people debate the necessity of the conservative resurgence. But if you look at some of the other denominations and you see the decline that they have experienced, then it helps us to appreciate what the Southern Baptist Convention went through, what our conservative leaders did to maintain conservative biblical theology in our convention. All right, that's really kind of far afield from this lecture. Does anyone have a question? Joey?
I was curious, is the Presbyterian Church in Scotland, so it's still state church over there, do they have any connection with the Presbyterian Church around the world, or is it just segregated? Or is it like Catholicism with different nations with Catholicism?
Okay. Joey is asking about the nature of the Presbyterian State Church in Scotland, and it is an independent state church. In other words, there's no connection between the Scottish Church and the American Church or the Presbyterian Church elsewhere. It's a little different with the Church of England or the Anglican Church, the Episcopal Church, because there are some connections around the world. But as far as I know, the Scottish State Church is independent of others. But it probably has gone the way of state churches in Europe in that probably most members, they're baptized as infants, and so their connection to the church is probably more according to name rather than according to personal faith. All right, any other questions? Yes, Kent?
Isn't there two Presbyterian groups in America?
Yes, Kent properly observes that the Presbyterian Church USA, which I've just described, is the very liberal branch. There is another branch that's the Presbyterian Church of America, and they are more conservative. I believe they do have women in leadership, but they have a much. They don't allow the ordination or union of homosexuals, and much more conservative theologically and biblically, and obviously had this split along the modernist, fundamentalist controversies back in the mid-20th century. Okay, so thanks for making that clear. Yes, there are at least two branches of the Presbyterian Church in America, one liberal and one more conservative. Yes, Steve?
What started the Presbyterian Church, PCUSA, I guess? What started the Presbyterian Church in America down this road? When you say modernism, do you mean like the philosophy of Descartes modernism, or just...
Okay.
What do you mean by modernism? I guess I'm asking.
Okay. Steve is asking what began the decline of the Presbyterian Church in the United States. And the modernist fundamentalist conflict began in the beginning of the 20th century. The issues mainly were Darwinism, that is the theory of evolution, and biblical criticism. This idea out of Germany that the Bible is really a human book, and so being critical of the Bible. I don't mean as in bad mouthing it. I just mean applying the theories of criticism to the Bible as well as to other literature. And so, of course, the ultimate end of that is the minimizing the authority and the inspiration of the Scripture. So those two things, evolution and the denial of the authority of Scripture, rose up in the early 20th century, and those are the issues that led to the decline of the Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Church, the Episcopal Church, and even Baptists in the North. And so we'll talk at length about this when we get to Unit 6. So I'm just kind of bringing this up now because the Presbyterian Church was really the comparison between 1900 and 2012 is so dramatic because before the modernist controversy, we have Princeton was a conservative Christian university with such scholars as B.B. Warfield and A.A. Hodge and Charles Hodge, but then J. Gresham Machen began to confront modernism as it crept into the Presbyterian seminaries and actually led a split that ultimately led to the Presbyterian Church of America. So yes, I would say the early 20th century, and this modernist fundamentalist conflict was strong in the North in the early 1900s. Didn't come to the South until about the mid-1900s. But there was more influence in the North from Europe, and it just kind of took a while to trickle down to the South. Okay, but again, we'll talk at length about the modernist fundamentalist conflict when we get to Unit 6. Okay, any other questions? Thank you for your interest. Well, it's a little bit earlier than we normally break, but let's go ahead and take our break now. This is one of the shorter lectures, and then when we come back, we'll talk about the Catholic Counter-Reformation.